For 4 centuries, it was the heartbeat of the world. It wasn't just a building. It was the intersection of heaven and earth, Solomon's Temple. Clad in the finest gold of Ophir, braced with the massive cedars of Lebanon, and shrouded in the thick smoke of continuous incense. For the people of Israel, this wasn't just a national monument, it was the literal footstool of the Almighty. They believed that as long as those limestone walls stood, they were invincible. But in the summer of 586 BC, the unthinkable happened. The Babylonian war machine, led by the iron-fisted Nebuchadnezzar II, breached the walls. Within days, the gold was stripped, the cedar was kindled, and 400 years of worship vanished into a column of black smoke. But as the smoke cleared, a mystery emerged, one that has haunted archaeologists, theologians, and treasure hunters for over 2,000 years. When the Babylonian accountants meticulously listed every gold spoon, every silver basin, and every bronze pillar taken as loot, one item was missing: the most important object in the world, the Ark of the Covenant. Where did it go? Why did God allow His own home to be burned? And what happens when a nation mistakes a building for the God who inhabits it? Today, we go back to 586 BC to witness the end of an era and the birth of a mystery. To understand the tragedy, we have to understand the obsession. The people of Judah had developed what scholars call temple theology. They believed the temple was a lucky charm. In the book of Jeremiah, we see the people chanting a phrase like a magical incantation. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." Jeremiah 7:4. They thought God was a hostage to His own architecture. They believed He had to protect them because His name was there. But while they polished the outside of the temple, the inside of their hearts was rotting. The historical record in 2 Chronicles 36:14-16 paints a grim picture. Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations and defiling the temple of the Lord. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through His messengers again and again. But they mocked God's messengers, despised His words, and scoffed at His prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against His people, and there was no remedy. Idolatry wasn't just happening in the dark corners. It was happening inside the temple courts. Social injustice was rampant. The poor were crushed, while the elite offered expensive sacrifices. The spiritual debt had reached its limit. The remedy was gone. Enter the catalyst of the collapse, King Zedekiah. Zedekiah was a man caught between a rock and a hard place. He was a puppet king, placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar after the previous king was hauled off in chains. Zedekiah had sworn a holy oath by the name of Yahweh to be loyal to Babylon. But Zedekiah was weak. He was a reed shaken by the wind. In 589 BC, pressured by his pro-Egyptian advisors, he committed a fatal political and spiritual error. He broke his oath. He rebelled against Babylon and sent envoys to Egypt, hoping for a military bailout. The prophet Ezekiel, watching from exile in Babylon, saw this as the final straw. He declared that because Zedekiah despised his oath, he would die in Babylon. In January 588 BC, the horizon turned gray with dust. The Babylonian army, a professional force of nearly 100,000 men, arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. Inside, a mere 10,000 defenders waited. Nebuchadnezzar didn't rush the walls. He was a master of siege warfare. He built towers, dug trenches, and simply waited. He decided to let hunger do the work that swords could not. There was one moment of false hope. An Egyptian army marched north. The Babylonians temporarily lifted the siege to deal with them. The streets of Jerusalem erupted in celebration. People thought Jeremiah was a fraud. But Jeremiah stood in the middle of the party and dropped a bombshell. Do not deceive yourselves. Even if you were to defeat the entire Babylonian army and only wounded men were left in their tents, they would come out and burn this city down. Jeremiah 37, 9-10. He was right. Egypt retreated, Babylon returned, and the noose tightened. For 18 months, Jerusalem was a pressure cooker of horror. This is the part of history books usually skip because it's too graphic. With no fields to farm and the water supply dwindling, food prices skyrocketed until there was nothing left to buy. The Book of Lamentations, written by an eyewitness, provides a haunting, visceral account of the starvation. Their appearance is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become as dry as a stick. Lamentations 4:8. It gets worse. The text records that the hands of compassionate women boiled their own children for food. This wasn't hyperbole. It was the reality of a city being eaten from the inside out. Jeremiah continued to preach a message that sounded like treason. Surrender to the Babylonians and live. For this, he was beaten and thrown into a cistern, a pit of deep mud, to starve. He was only saved by a foreigner, an Ethiopian named Ebed-Melech, who pulled him out with ropes. By July 586 BC, the city reached its breaking point. The children had stopped crying because they no longer had the breath to make a sound. The defenders were ghosts in armor. On the 9th day of the month, the Babylonian battering rams finally smashed through the northern wall. As the Babylonians poured into the city, King Zedekiah attempted a desperate escape. He fled through a secret gate near the king's garden, heading toward the plains of Jericho. In a cruel twist of irony, he was captured on the very plains where Israel had won its first great victory under Joshua. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah for judgment. The sentence was terrifyingly precise. 1. Zedekiah's sons were executed before his eyes. 2. Then the Babylonians gouged out Zedekiah's eyes. The last thing he ever saw was the death of his lineage. He was then bound in bronze shackles and dragged to Babylon, exactly as the prophets had foretold. A month later, a specialist arrived, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard. His mission was not to occupy, but to erase. He systematically torched the 4 pillars of Judah's identity. 1. The Temple of Solomon. 2. The royal palace. 3. The houses of the nobility. 4. The city walls. The fire was so intense that the gold plating on the temple walls melted, seeping into the cracks of the stone. The great bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, were shattered and hauled away as scrap metal. The Babylonians took a meticulous inventory of the spoils. 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 52 list everything: the bronze sea, the pots, the shovels, the snuffers, the spoons, the bowls. But look closely at the list. The Ark of the Covenant is missing. It isn't mentioned as being captured. It isn't mentioned as being destroyed. It simply disappears from the biblical narrative. The theories of the lost ark. Where did it go? The hidden cache. Some believe the priests hid it in a secret chamber deep beneath the Temple Mount. The Warren's shaft theory. Mount Nebo. The apocryphal book of 2 Maccabees says Jeremiah took the ark and the altar of incense and hid them in a cave on Mount Nebo, sealing the entrance. The Ethiopian connection. A popular tradition suggests it was moved years earlier to Aksum, Ethiopia, for safekeeping. The simple truth. Some historians suggest it may have been captured during an earlier raid, or simply broken down for its gold by the Babylonians, who didn't recognize its religious significance. Whatever the case, the earthly throne of God was gone. To the average observer, it looked like the god of Babylon, Marduk, had defeated the God of Israel. But the prophet Ezekiel provides a different, supernatural perspective. In Ezekiel chapters 10 and 11, the prophet has a terrifying vision of the kavod, the Shekinah glory of God. He sees the glory of God slowly, almost reluctantly, leaving the temple. First, it moves from the Holy of Holies to the threshold. Then it moves to the eastern gate. Finally, it lifts off and settles on the Mount of Olives, looking back at the city before departing. The message was clear. God was not evicted. He moved out. He left because the people had turned his house into a den of thieves and an idol's shrine. The building was empty long before the fire touched it. The fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC is one of the darkest chapters in the Bible. But it wasn't the end. God is a God of the remnant. Even in judgment, he kept his promises. He preserved the line of David through the captive King Jehoiachin. He preserved the temple vessels in the treasuries of Babylon. Exactly 70 years later, the Babylonian Empire fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia. In an unprecedented move, Cyrus allowed the Jews to return. He handed back the 5,400 gold and silver items stolen by Nebuchadnezzar. A second temple was built. It wasn't as grand as Solomon's, and the Ark of the Covenant was still missing. The Holy of Holies was now an empty room. But centuries later, a young rabbi from Nazareth would walk into that temple. He would look at the massive stones and say, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He was talking about his body. The story of 586 BC teaches us a powerful lesson. God is not interested in gold-plated walls or religious symbols if they aren't backed by a faithful heart. He would rather burn down his own house than live in it with a people who don't love him. The Ark remains lost to history, perhaps because we no longer need a gold box to find God's presence. The tragedy of the temple was the end of a building, but it was the beginning of a faith that could live anywhere, even in exile. As we look at the ruins of history, we are reminded, the structures we build may crumble, but the word of our God stands forever.